My name's Patrick Coates. I'm the Chief Revenue Officer at Certiverse. What I'm going to do is just talk a little bit about Certiverse and what we do, and then I'm going to talk a little bit more about, perhaps from a layperson's perspective. Alan's our AI expert. What I am, I'm the person that perhaps sees things from a different perspective, from the point of view of someone that uses technology. Like I said, I've been in the industry for a very long time now, and well, over 30 years. I think that's a long time. And I've seen a lot of changes in the industry, but for me, the biggest one that's had the most impact and will continue to do so is how AI is being used. I just want to put a little bit of context in terms of Certiverse. We're an end-to-end platform used for people to be able to design and create assessments. We have actually, since our first inception, sort of 3-4 years ago, we've always been using some form of AI within the platform. Initially, it was the NLP, natural language processing, which was used to be able to provide advice and guidance to SMEs who were creating tasks, etc., or creating content to help them in terms of the best practice around the psychometric rules of writing items. And then it was in the onset of basically generative AI that we introduced the option of being able to use AI to write items. I must tell this story actually, because when we first, Alan has been working with GPT from when it was as a toddler, when it was version 1.0. So he's got a lot of experience. And we had a conversation, I think it was probably September time of 2021, about, should we introduce AI for writing item? No one's going to be really interested, are they? And then, of course, November happened, ChatGPT became the big thing. The thing for me, and I know there are other versions about GPT, was that it not only was it something that had never been available before, but it was affordable. The fact that you could use generative AI very cheaply to be able to undertake lots of tasks, etc. We continue to innovate using it to do other things on the platform in terms of creating exams, etc., equated forms. We're going to be using it more and more to improve things, but it's almost become a bit like a spell checker in Word or a grammar checker in Word. We almost don't make a big deal about it anymore. However, we are going to be here on this session because we've got some interesting information to share. If you just go on, please, Alan. So, as I said, I'm talking about this from a layperson's perspective. I'm going to talk a little bit about the fundamentals of machine learning, and then automatic item generation, then also AI generation of content. So that's the first half. And then Alan's going to talk much more about the in-depth components around the how we're using AI to write items and the particular piece of research that he's undertaken. So you could move on, please, Alan. So if you talk about the fundamentals of e-learning, so machine learning has been around for a very long time. It's not new, as has NLP. So the difference is it's much more structured in terms of what you're asking it to do. So machine learning, it learns a task and it's then able to replicate that task. Natural language process, very similar. It's a set of rules that have been learned. You can apply it in that particular context, but that's the context in which you've trained it and what it's been used for. The big difference between large language models and generative AI is it's been trained on data on the internet about how speech, language, how is structured. And what the generative AI is doing is, as Alan explained it to me once, is it's predicting what the next word would be in a sequence based on a prompt that you provide, which I'll talk a little bit more about later on. It still amazes me that every day we've got customers from Certiverse who are in the license to practice space, licensure, so they're doing health and safety, they're doing medical, they're doing clinical assessments, they're doing IT, and it works in all those contexts in terms of creating content. It still amazes me every day. So I use it every day anyway, but particularly in that context. There's always one thing I would say is that you still see a little bit of negativity about generative AI, and I will touch on the concept of hallucinations, but also it is secure. The AI that we're using is enterprise AI, i.e. it is secure, it's a walled garden, it's not whatever you put in is then available to everyone. You still do hear these horror stories about something that might have happened 2 or 3 years ago. But I would say Google tracks everything that you put into Google, and we're quite happy using that on an ongoing basis. So it's just a fact I think people sometimes distort the hype. Now, the language that's used in terms of AI, tokens and tokenization. So the unit of measurement, for want of a better word, that's used within these AI models, GPT, but it also applies to others, is a token. It's just a unit of measurement of a piece of information. So it's not a letter or a word. It's a token, basically, which applies to a chunk of that data. So whenever you're asking AI to do something, it's chunk it into tokens, and that's basically how it charges you. So the more information you put in, the more tokens you're using up, the more it costs you to use it, basically. And that becomes a little bit more relevant when you start to get to using a lot of data to provide the prompts into your model. So what's a prompt? A prompt is simply a piece of information you're providing to the AI model to ask it to do something. So write a sentence on XYZ, write a question on XYZ. You might not get it right first time because you think, well, actually, that's not quite what I wanted. So that's when you get the concept of prompt engineering. So what's happening is you're providing additional information about that. I want a question on this particular subject, and I'd like it to have a key and 3 distractors, or I would like an image as well to go with it, whatever it might be. So you're able to use that prompt engineering to get it to be able to do things that you want to get it right first time. Now in Certiverse, we've pre-trained that. So all the additional information, for example, the best practice about questions should be in a particular format. You've got, don't try not to use the word not, etc. All those things we've pre-trained into our model so that our customers don't have to do that. But if you're doing it yourself, anyone can go into GPT or one of the other tools and ask it to write questions. And it might be that you upload additional information, but Alan's going to talk a little bit more about that later on. So the other thing to mention is this temperature. So the concept of temperature is how creative or how deterministic it might be. So if you do it at 0, you get something that's very, very prescriptive. You wouldn't do that because there's no creativity. It's very, very limited in terms of what it's providing. You did it 1, you might end up something that's totally off the wall. So typically, we sort of set the temperature around 0.7. I always thought it went to 0 to 1, but actually might go up higher than that now. I think there might be other models that go up to 2. But the point being is the higher the number, the more creative it is, the more variance you might get, which is what you want. You don't want it to create exactly the same thing every time. You want it to think a bit differently and create different questions in different formats, different structures, different variables. So you've just gone to the next one, please, Alan. Now, in terms of machine learning, it's been used for a while, and I've been in the industry a very long time, and you heard this concept about AIG. So AIG is nothing to do with AI, it's just automated item generation. So AIG it's still around, it's been used, it's very structured in terms of it is. So it's very good at writing content within a predefined criteria. So it's very template based. 6 plus 7 equals 13. Right, it might be X plus Y equals 13. So the X and Y could be 10 and 3, it could be 6 and 7, it could be 5 and 8, etc. So it's much more structured in terms of what it does. Now, you'll also find that the templates that you create can be used in a particular use case. If you had an exam with multiple questions on multiple topics, you'd have to use that. You'd have to have a template for each one, basically, because it's only very good at doing what you ask it to do. So it's been around for a long time. It's still being used. There's no issues with it, but there's better ways of doing it using AI. You just go on to the next slide, please, Alan. So the other context we talk about is AI generated. So this is what we're talking about here. It's creating the items from scratch entirely from whatever the information that it's got is. It still amazes me. I mean, it's called zero shot, which Alan will talk a bit about later on. But literally, any topic you say, write me a question based on this criteria, it will write you a question based on that type here. And you know what? Pretty good quality. Not perfect, but pretty good. So it's these GPT models, although there are other models as well, that are really changing the way that you're able to create content based on any topic. It is very, very good at doing, and there's been research on this, multiple choice items it's really, really good at, which of course a lot of the standardized assessments are multiple choice items. It's also really good at writing scenarios. So you can still have a multiple choice question, but it's writing a scenario. I'm setting up this server. This happens, what would I do? So it's very good at writing those sort of scenarios and then the possible answers to those. Personality items, again, different sort of item types, different topic domain. And then passages with reading comprehension as well. So it's very, very good at doing those sort of topics, irrespective of the subject matter that's being done. And that is something that's key because it means that you can apply it in very, very different contexts. So it's the opposite of the machine learning AIG model, which was very, very structured. It's much more free reign in terms of what it can do and what you can allow it to do. So that enables any organization that we're working with, and of course yourself, to be able to use that. So hopefully that provides you with a little bit of context. You just go on, please, Alan. So I'm now going to pass you over to Alan, who's going to talk a little bit more about the specifics, and I'll take over and answer any of the questions that people have. So over to you, Alan.
Excellent. Can everybody hear me? My name is Alan Mead. I'm the chief psychometrician for Certiverse, and we have been working with AI. My story about this is that Ruben, our boss, suggested I look at this ChatGPT-3, and I said, "Oh, Ruben, it's just a stochastic parrot. It just, it just fills in the next word." I did. This happened a couple times, and finally I looked at it, and the first time I told it to write a multiple choice item, and it just wrote a multiple choice item, I thought, "Huh, this is going to be something we want to pay closer attention to." And this was about a year before ChatGPT, and then the rest of the world found out about it. So I've been using AI actually for a while. And I think that the amazing thing about these models is how much better they are. We've had AI for, well, longer than I've been alive, but that AI has evolved. And I think the models that we have today are much more impressive in their capabilities. For somebody who's used AI, it's apparent. And that means that they're not perfect, but they're more capable of helping us with things like writing items. So we did a study where we compared 3 prompting methods. As Patrick said, the way that you control generative AI is by writing prompts, as I'm sure you all know. I'm sure you've all done that. And we don't have very much research comparing different prompting strategies. There's a literature on prompt engineering, which is helpful, but that doesn't really address these issues. And so we compared 3 different prompting strategies for generating knowledge-based certification items. One is zero shot. Zero shot actually means that you give it no examples, which is true. Well, let's just say that zero shot is a shorthand in this presentation for as if you sat down at the ChatGPT prompt and said, "Please write me an item about this topic for this exam." So zero shot is just using it the way that you use ChatGPT. Agentic is a word. If you haven't heard the word agentic, agentic is the new AI. You will hear all about agentic. Agentic will soon be meaningless because everything will be agentic. But agentic is the future. And Andrew Ng is a well-known. He was a deep learning theorist, and he's well-known in the AI sphere. You've probably heard of him. He describes the difference as when you use zero-shot prompting, it's like you're asking the AI to write out an answer, write out an item or an essay or whatever, or the code or whatever you're asking it for, without stopping, without thinking about it, without backtracking, just write it all down. And it does amazingly at that. But wouldn't it be better to ask it to think about it? And there's data, like he's presented data, for example, in the talk I'm thinking of, that suggests that we can use the current models, which are imperfect, but which are good, and we can actually have them performing at a higher level. We can make them perform at a higher level by having them use an agentic approach. And that means to not just spit out the answer, but to think about the answer. And I'll talk in a little more detail about our approach and whether it's really agentic, but that was one of our interests. And then RAG has been described as one of the worst names for one of the coolest ideas. It's quite popular in some circles. It refers to Retrieval-Augmented Generation. And RAG is very much like zero shot. It's not agentic. It's not asking the AI to think about it. But what it does is you start with the idea that you have a database of information. And like we used a textbook and we broke it up into sections. And you are able to retrieve the chunk of text that is related to the query. And you simply, and the query is like the zero shot. You sit down and ask it to write an item about a topic, and you append, by the way, please use the following information and formulate your answer, and you paste in the chunk or chunks of information that you retrieved. And that's what RAG is. So we were interested in whether these could outperform, especially Agentic and RAG, could outperform zero shot. And by the way, we used GPT-4 Turbo, and we used the temperature of 0.8 for what it's worth. So I don't know if you have time to read this prompt, but this is a prompt. It's very similar to what we've used in the past. The long and short of this is it's a set of instructions asking the AI to write an item. write an item with a scenario about a blueprint domain, on a specific topic. So this is the baseline. And we've already researched this, and we'll present this as the baseline. So this is the zero-shot prompt. And if these slides are available, you can see, or you can, but the prompt is probably what you would expect if you sat down and tried to prompt it to write some items. And then the Agentic involved three prompts. First, we had the exact same prompt that you just saw that said, please write an item. Then we took the item and we stuck it into the text of a second prompt, your test development support bot focused on reviewing multiple choice test items on a psych nutrition exam, blah, blah, blah. And we gave it specific, you will evaluate the item on various aspects. Does the item assess the specific topic? If not, include an explanation in a separate field. And we had a series of 12 or 15 review that were based on the Halodyne and Downing rules for writing items that we asked it to review. And for each one, it said yes or no, it met the rule. And if it didn't, then it provided some explanation. And if it did, then we could add up all the yeses. And if it was a complete pass, then we didn't have to move on to the third prompt. But if there was any miss, any fail, then we could move on to the third prompt, where we asked it to modify the original item to address the comments. And remember, it had included an explanation of the comment. So we simply put the review response in the item text, and then it sent back an item. So that was the agentic approach that we used. And there was a question. Or an answer. Finally, RAG. I'll be honest, we used AG. We skipped the retrieval part. And it's a little tiny bit of a long story, but I think retrieval is kind of an interesting topic all by itself. Like, I'm glossing over things that people have done dissertations about. And what we did was we read through a textbook and we picked the specific parts of the textbook that we wanted it to write an item, and we formulated an item topic. And those are the item topics we use in this research. So we already knew how the item topic was related to the text. We handpicked the sections of the text that would be related. And so I think this is a best case scenario for RAG because there's no possibility of retrieval errors. You could argue maybe that an actual retrieval process might be more effective, or one of my students and I were having an argument about whether the retrieval process could be beneficial in some other regard. So if so, we didn't do any retrieval. We knew where we wanted. And so we just picked those sections of the textbook that we knew to be related to the item topic to augment. And the prompt itself was very simple. And this is, I had a little trouble finding an actual example of RAG, and there's probably different ways of doing it, but I took this from a paper. So we took the same zero-shot prompt, and we simply added the red text. We added two hashes on a new line. Please use the following augmentation information with directory response, and we put the chunks in. So the RAG prompt was exactly the same as zero-shot with the augmentation text at the bottom. How are we doing for time? Am I taking too long? So let's jump into the results. There was actually a series of research questions, and I could elaborate, but one of the things we're interested in is how broadly usable are the items. This is characteristic of how we've done things in the past, how we've done research, and how other people studying AI in AIG have done research. We took each item that was written for each of the three approaches, and we rated it on a 4-point scale, where 1 is useless, 2 means that there's a lot of edits that you need, 3 means that there's minor edits needed, and 4 means that it's ready as is or practically ready as is. And so the means here, 3.3 to 3.43, represent 3.3 or 3.4 out of 4, and that's pretty good. It means that the average item probably needs minor edits. Maybe there's a few that need many edits, and there's several that are ready to go as is. I guess that's good news or bad news. If you were expecting all 4s, then I guess it's bad news. That we're not in an all 4s situation. But, on the other hand, these are clearly useful items. Minor edits are good. And if I have a little time, I can talk about what minor edits are. For example, if you have to fix one key, that would be a minor edit. But if you have to rewrite all the distractors, that's a major edit. That would be a 2. So in terms of our research question about whether these improve things, these are all fairly similar numbers. I wouldn't, clearly 3.29 is not bigger than 3.33. So RAG didn't apparently add much. It might not actually be worse. It's probably about the same. And Agentic was a little bit better. We actually know exactly why Agentic was better. And I'm underwhelmed with the explanation. And I'll explain it. It turned out that the AI is not good at reviewing its own output. So we asked the AI to write an item. Whoops, I'm not doing anything bad. Don't need to learn me. Write an item and then review that same item to some criteria. And it passed the vast majority of the items. Even if there were problems that we observed with the items, it passed them. So it's not good at reviewing its own work. If you have two different AI models, I think they might be effective. But it makes a certain amount of sense that the AI is what it is, and it's not good at reviewing its own work, at least not in the way that we did it. Maybe if you asked it to think about it some more and then to evaluate that thought process, think about ways that the correct answer might not be correct. Think about ways the distractor could be correct. Think about ways that somebody could read the question that's not on topic. Think about ways that this could be unclear, and then asked it to evaluate that, then maybe it could be better about it. But it wasn't very good at reviewing its own work in the way that we used it. So there was exactly one problem that distinguishes the Agentic from the zero shot, and that is that it could determine whether or not it had created a scenario. So remember, we asked for a question with a scenario. Sometimes it would create a scenario. Sometimes it would just ask the question without any preamble. And it was good at detecting that it had failed to add a scenario. And in those circumstances, it added a scenario. But it wasn't so great at anything else. So I'm underwhelmed. That's nice, but I'm underwhelmed with the performance of the Agentic, at least the way that we've done it here. So 90% of the items were rated as a 4 or a 3, so they're good items, and the Agentic approach was only effective in adding scenarios. Now, when we look at the items, the most common errors that we see are things that queue and answer, and that's especially true for RAG. And that means that there might be some wording in the stem that is exactly parallel as wording in the key that gives away the answer. Implausible distractors were a problem, maybe less so for RAG perhaps. And there were some items that had no scenario, and that's the difference between Agentic and zero shot. RAG had its own problems. There were more answer queues, and we think that's because it's paying more attention to the augmentation material, so it's more likely to copy that material into the stem and the answers, the key or the distractors. And but it was a dramatic difference. I took that slide out, but it was a big difference in terms of the number of items that had that problem. And there was a typo in the textbook, and it carried it over into the item. So again, it's beholden to the augmentation information. And then the last problem that's unique to RAG is that the textbook might talk about something, and it might have an example, and the RAG approach will accept that example and will act as though the test taker knows that example, even if that example is not a common example. Like it might, there might have been an example about Alan doing something, and the test question might say, what did Alan do? And that's not a fair question. And that never arises outside of RAG. It only applies when there's augmentation text. I'm okay for time, aren't I? So you might have heard that there's a new model out, the O1 Mini and O1 Preview. I think at one point I'd heard those called the strawberry models. So we were interested in how well those models compared. And so we did a comparison. This is a subset of the items. The model, I think it's now out. I think I can now do an API call, but all of the research that we've talked about, not that it matters because it's just a toy domain, but used API calls, but the O1 models weren't available that way. So they were more onerous to do it. So we randomly chose 15 items, and only one of us rated the results. So these numbers are a little bit different, even for the conditions, because of there being 15 items and only one of the raters. But what I see when I look at this is that these are lower than the O1 model, that the O1 model is a bit better. And I don't know how much time I have to talk about this model, but this model is apparently agentic. I think that OpenAI is being less than perfectly open, but I think they've been clear that these O1 models have two ways that they're different. I'd be awfully surprised if they don't use the 4 Omni AI engine. So they're probably the 4 Omni, which is very similar to GPT-4 Turbo. It's GPT-4 derived. And they apparently, in some way that's not been specified, think about the problem before answering. So they are agentic. And apparently also, the reason that you hear PhDs or PhD level associated with them is that OpenAI did a special study and spent a lot of money having people with advanced degrees like PhDs do something called reinforcement learning from human feedback. So humans look at the output, maybe 2 different outputs, and pick one that they like better. And they did a lot of that, and they fine-tuned the model to produce the kind of output that these people expected. So those are the 2 differences: additional reinforcement learning from human feedback using advanced users and being agentic. And so that apparently is the reason for this somewhat, I mean, it's a noticeable increase, but at the same time, if you were expecting 4s, we're not at 4s. So slightly higher usability, and they were noticeably better. Like, for example, they were better at identifying item flaws in the review phase. Here's an actual example. The stem closely mirrors the wording of the correct answer, which may cue test takers to the correct answer. So I guess these sorts of comments, I mean, we realize we're dealing with a neural network and a machine, but these sorts of comments are the kinds of comments that make us think, oh yeah, that's more intelligent. Like, not that we're at artificial general intelligence, but that this is clearly a more intelligent answer. And these models do seem like they provide more intelligent feedback. One other thing I thought might be interesting is we kept track of the cost, and we also have some other metrics about time, and we had to pay for the O1 preview, so we know how much that cost. But because it's not available in API, we don't have that data about the timing. But the timing is similar. The models do take longer. The O1 preview and the O1. I guess one of these this should be O1 mini, and this should be O1 preview. Sorry about that. Oh, I'm sorry. They're right here. Oh, I see. So this is with zero shot, and this is with zero shot with review. So this amount is a penny, essentially, 1.1 pennies for zero shot with GPT-4 Turbo, and it rises to about a little less than 2 cents for Agentic, and that's literally because it's doing mostly 2 prompts. It's doing 1 prompt and review prompt. If we had more revision, it would probably be a bit more, but we're talking about, three pennies or something like that. And then RAG was a bit more, and that's because the augmentation text increased the prompt size, and you're charged by the number of tokens going in and the number of tokens coming out. And so, but all of these are very small. And O1 Mini was similar in its cheapness. But O1 Preview was still not expensive, 15 cents and a quarter, but much bigger in terms of the cost than the other models. So I guess on the one hand, all of these are really cheap if you're generating items, cheap enough, for example, that there wouldn't be any problem with simply generating items and rejecting items if they're not good. I'm not sure that anyone actually needs to edit the items, or at least not do significant edits to items. I think I'd probably regenerate them. On the other hand, I talked about agentic being the new thing, and it's clear that some agentic approaches can have vastly more cost associated with them because the AI is doing a lot more work. Instead of you asking it to do something and boom, it does it right then, it stops and thinks about it and makes a plan. It consults tools, perhaps. They just enabled web search, for example, on ChatGPT for everybody who's logged in, who has access to, like even the free version. So that's an example of a tool. I don't know if you've noticed this, if it's come up with your use of ChatGPT, but it will also sometimes write Python code and spin up an interpreter and evaluate the output. Maybe that's just prompts that I write. But those are tools that are available to the agent, and those cost money and time. So that's why time is also similar to the cost. I think in theory, OpenAI is charging based on the time. So I think we've got quite a bit of time. I've got some conclusions. My conclusion is that prompting strategy didn't matter that much. And maybe it's because the items are already pretty good. The new O1 models, the strawberry models, were better. They were noticeably better. And they weren't that different from each other. And the cost was pretty dramatically different for O1 Mini versus O1 Preview. So I think I'll probably be pursuing the O1 Mini in the future. Current state-of-the-art AI models, and I think the strawberry models, for example, are definitely state-of-the-art. They produce good items. The items are not perfect. And that means that we have to have SMEs review every item to identify the items that are imperfect. And they'll probably need to revise many of those items at least a little bit. The last thing that I want to say about this research in general is that we chose the domain, and the domain was only visible in a few places. But if you saw the items, they're very psychometric items, because my co-author and I are psychometricians, and we're familiar with that topic. So I think that's a good topic. I think it's a little bit esoteric. I think the fact that it is able to generate items for psychometrics bodes well for generating them items for all different domains. But clearly there's some domains at some point that would be beyond the knowledge that it has. And there's some other characteristics of that domain that aren't perfectly generalizable. Like, for example, we deal with people who have legislative changes or software changes. There's version 2.0 of the software, and there's no such thing for psychometrics. And of course, when you have a legislation change or you have a new version of the software, you always want the items to be written to the latest version. You don't want anything written to the earlier version. So psychometrics doesn't have any analog, or there's no such thing as a psychometrics for Illinois and a different psychometrics for federal. So I think that we need to generalize this research to other domains. And I presume that all of you work with various domains, and it would be great to replicate this research in other domains. So if we have some time, and I think we do have some time, correct me if I'm wrong, Andrea or Patrick.
Yep,
I'd like to talk a little bit about future directions. And one of them I'd like to ask and I guess answer the question of whether our approach is really agentic. And I would say that let's call it agentic light, or internally we're calling it agentic 1.0, because it's not very autonomous. And there's a good reason for that. I don't want the AI on an item by item basis to decide what rules it should, or what criteria it should apply to whether an item is good or not. I feel like I already know what criteria apply to whether an item is good or not. And I wanted to apply those criteria, not some criteria that comes up with itself, and certainly not criteria that it comes up with itself for every item on an item by item basis. So the autonomy was lower, but but not necessarily on purpose. But as I have down here, we have experimented with having the AI think harder about the item, and that has generated some successes similar to the strawberry model that we saw. The other aspect of agentic approaches is that, generally speaking, you give them tools. And this is a topic that might not be perfectly clear. I think a lot of people think that the GPT model was already searching the web for them or something like that. We were generating references, and the references weren't always very good. And somebody said, oh, well, maybe it indexed that URL, and then the URL changed. And I said, yeah. And then I thought, wait a minute, it never indexed that URL. That would be a tool. It would have to go do a web search or retrieve that URL and look at it. And that's a tool that agents can use. That's now a tool that ChatGPT has available. But that is not what the model is doing. Another tool would be sending an email, looking up rates, writing Python code and spinning up an interpreter and evaluating the results. So agents should have tools, but we don't have good tools for the agents for writing items. We don't have there's no API that you can call to verify that the answer is correct or that a distractor is incorrect. I don't think a web search is a general solution. Like, I don't trust that we do a web search and see whether this is a good, key or something like that. That might work sometimes. I'm not sure it's going to be a good general purpose. And there could be a corpus, and we could, and we did develop one for RAG, and that was part of this research. But I don't want to assume that we would always have a corpus, that the first step before you are able to write items with the AI is that you have to assemble this corpus. That might be something that we develop in the future. But I think that would be useful for some exam programs and probably not useful for every exam program. So those are some ideas about future directions. And I think that is the end of my slides.
Great. Okay, we did have a couple questions come in. One was, I have a participant who said they have asked for items supported by a specific reference work, such as an ANSI standard, and had good success. But what's concerning is that the work is behind the paywall. So how does it do this? And am I right to be uncomfortable with it?
Well, I'm not sure. Actually, I'm not sure that I understand the context. These models all, used data scraped from the internet. I think that people have the misapprehension that the models memorize the internet and are just regurgitating it, and that's not happening. So, the models are doing something very similar to you or I reading the internet and then answering from that basis. And, we shall see what happens with copyright law and whether, what the outcome is. I think it's very similar to a SME who's learned the material and is generating an item. But my opinions on this topic are not necessarily the ones that will win the day. So I think there's that consideration that the model has been trained on lots of data, and you don't ever know what that data is. Sarah Silverman wrote a book, and the model can talk about her book, and she assumes, therefore, that the model was trained on her book and that that's inappropriate. She never gave permission. Again, this is a gray area. As far as I know, not being a lawyer, I think Sarah Silverman certainly gave permission to the world to read her book, but of course, only if you purchased a copy. So I'm not sure how that all worked. And I don't know how that's going to come out. I think that is probably the biggest problem, because I don't think it's possible to build a large language model. Most of the learning that it learned, by the way, like Sarah's book, it's learning the English language, or, other things written in other languages, reading other languages. It's understanding how the language works together. Most of it is not knowledge in the sense that we think of knowledge. And it's not possible to build the kinds of models, I think, as far as we know, it's not possible without a mountain of data. And the mountain is truly prodigious. It's not a mountain of data that any one organization is likely to ever have. Maybe a big publishing company might have a mountain of data like that, perhaps. But I think it's very unlikely that we'll have AI that are like ChatGPT, that are able to generate language fluently without having it trained on a very large corpus of data that would necessarily have to involve some use that, OpenAI would like to, and other AI researchers would like to call, fair use, just reading the information to understand the statistical relationship amongst the words, with a huge mountain of other data.
Actually, can I add to that, Alan? So this is a question I get asked quite a lot, actually, in terms of my day-to-day role, when people are asking about, but how do you train it on something specific to do? And the example, I was two examples I was give. One was I was doing some work with the pharmaceutical organization, and there was a particular question said, how does GPT work for that, etc. And I used that example, and it created a question. And then it said, oh, by the way, you want to check the latest government guidelines on X, Y, Z, referring to the body of material. But it didn't say it'd use that material. It was just saying you might want to double check it. And I think that's something that's changed over the last few years using the GPT models. If you ask it, for example, to do something about write a biography for Patrick Coates, it won't use LinkedIn, for example. It would have done 2 years ago, but it won't now. Or if you say, could you use LinkedIn to write a bio, it'll say, I'm sorry, I'm not able to access that information. If you just ask it to write a biography of Patrick Coates, it'll just make something up, and they'll put random Patrick Coates, as I've found out when I've tried it numerous times. I think the other example, the one that still I always like, is in the IT sector. It's an environment that changes constantly. New version of the technology coming out, etc., new iterations. And I know customers that I've spoken to, they've found it really successful. They say, no, we can't possibly have it write items on our new product because it's not out yet. But actually, it's really, really good at writing the context. But what people are doing is it's that information that you put into the prompt. If you're just saying write an item on product X, now it might not know. But if you write it's a bit more like the RAG model, let's say. So if you write an item and here's some additional information, it will write. But if you're using enterprise AI, it's behind that firewall, so it's not doing. So if you're talking about something specific that's your IP, that's yours, you can manage that. If you're talking about how the whole LLM models are trained using all the data on the internet, that's very, very difficult to do. And I don't think you can put the genie back in that bottle, to be quite frank, to say how you could manage that.
Other questions? I responded to a question in the chat. I'm not sure if everyone can see it or if I just responded to Andre and Patrick. We did not pretest the items. The items, we wrote items for psychometrics exam, and we don't have a large sample of psychometricians. So we weren't able to pretest them. I think that would be a better design to be able to pretest the items. And I bet you all are only writing items that you can pretest. So how about that? But I do think, I'm pretty confident that if we think the items are 3s and 4s, and that if we were to actually fix the 3s to be 4s, that those would mostly pretest well. You know, like the average beta test on the Certiverse platform, over 90% of the items survive beta testing. So I think that would probably be the case with these items as well.
We've got a very high percentage. I think it's not just about writing. We use AI to write items. You don't have to. We've also got a workflow that makes it easy. And I mentioned before about NLP to improve the speed. But in terms of writing items using AI, end to end, it's really, in going through review, you're talking sort of 10, 15 minutes to write an item, as to maybe 25 minutes without using the AI. I think the other feedback we also got for SMEs, they found it made them a lot more creative because it was coming up with things they hadn't thought of. So you're getting more creativity in the items, perhaps, because you as we say, AI is biased, so are people. They tend to focus on things they're comfortable with and understand, so they tend to focus. So AI was providing them with a lot more options than perhaps we wouldn't have thought of. Plus, when you input in the prompts, you don't have to sit and worry about how it's exact, phrasing, is that a comma or a semicolon? You can just dump a load of ideas down and say, this is the sort of thing I want on a scenario, and it will take that, make sense of it, and then come up with a response. So it also makes it a lot easier and quicker. I'm not an expert at writing, etc. So things like that, scenarios that people might have struggled with, and I think that was your example using about text writing before, scenarios. It's very, very good at doing that if you just give it some ideas. So if I said, write an item on X, but if I say, write an on X about Patrick who works for Certiverse, then it would incorporate that information within the question and play it back to me. So it's very, very good at doing that.
So many applications, so little time to talk about them today.
Well, great. Well, thank you all for being here today. We appreciate your feedback, and we would be happy to answer additional questions. Oh, we did get one more if we want to sneak it in. The rest of you, you can make your choices. I know Alan's got a hard exit to accommodate, but we did have the question of, could we use AI for other aspects of item development, such as queuing and overlap, and how would that work?
Sure. By queuing, I think you mean item enemies where one item queues another item. And by overlap, I think you mean duplication amongst the items. And yeah, absolutely. That would use a technology, probably use a technology called embedding. Embedding is the retrieval part of RAG. Embedding is its own topic that we could talk about. It's totally cool. You take a piece of text and you determine what are essentially the GPS coordinates of that text within a semantic space, so a space based on meaning, just like our physical space. And you do that for every item in your pool. And then you can roll through the items in your pool and determine which items are next to each other in that semantic space. And that indicates that they're either talking about a similar topic, it might be duplicative, or that they might be enemy items. And as an example of that, using API calls from OpenAPI, I demoed a retrieval like this where there were psychometrics questions, and I asked about samples or sample size, and it pulled up items like, that asked about number of participants. So the sample size and number of participants means the same thing to us. And that's the magic of this AI, that it can relate those things as well, even though, in a typical search situation, there's no overlapping in the terms, unless, you have some really sophisticated way of mapping synonyms. So there are some neat applications of that, but that's its own talk, I think.
All right, fantastic. Well, thank you all again so much for coming. If you do have any additional questions, of course, you can reach out. So general email there, and Alan or Patrick at Certiverse.com will also get you directly to our presenters. So hope to see you next time, and we will have the video available for all our registrants. So if you need any review there as well. So thanks so much. Have a great day.
Thank you for coming.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.